What if the most humiliating night of your life turned out to be the exact night that saved it? Nobody warned Daniel that a prank could end in a wedding ring. Nobody warned him that the joke his friends were laughing about would become the truth he'd spend the rest of his life grateful for. But before any of that, there was just an ordinary Thursday, a garage full of grease-stained tools, and three friends who couldn't stop laughing. Daniel Reyes was 34 years old and had spent the last 12 years fixing engines in a small garage on the edge of Millbrook, a quiet town an hour outside Denver, Colorado. He worked with his hands, kept his head down, and rarely talked about his personal life, mostly because there wasn't much of one to talk about. His friends, Marcus, Tyler, and a mechanic named Grant who worked 2 bays down, had appointed themselves in charge of fixing that. For months, they teased him relentlessly. They said he'd married his toolbox. They said he flirted with carburetors more than people. Daniel laughed it off every time, half because it was funny and half because it stung more than he wanted to admit. So, when Marcus showed up one afternoon grinning like he'd won the lottery and announced he'd set Daniel up with someone, Daniel assumed it was another one of their jokes, the kind that ended with him standing alone at a bar while his friends filmed it from across the street. "Her name is Hannah," Marcus said. "Trust me, just show up." Daniel didn't trust him, not even a little. But something about the way Tyler avoided eye contact and Grant kept snorting into his coffee made Daniel suspicious enough to actually go, if only to catch them in the act. He almost turned around 3 separate times on the drive to the diner. He rehearsed what he'd say if the table was empty, how he'd storm back to the garage the next morning and threaten to fire all three of them, prank or not. His hands were tight on the wheel. His stomach was in knots that had nothing to do with hunger. This, he told himself, was going to be the worst 30 minutes of his week. He was wrong. He had no idea how wrong. Later, Daniel would admit that if his truck hadn't stalled at the last red light before the diner, giving him 30 extra seconds to think, he probably would have turned around after all. 30 seconds. That was the entire gap between the life he almost kept and the one he ended up living instead. The diner was called the Copper Spoon, a narrow place with cracked vinyl booths and a bell above the door that jingled too loud for how small the space was. Daniel stepped inside, half expecting an empty table and a group text full of laughing emojis. Instead, near the window, a woman sat alone with a paperback novel folded open in one hand and a cup of coffee going cold in front of her. She looked up before he even said a word, and something about the way she smiled, small, a little nervous, completely unguarded, made every excuse he'd rehearsed disappear from his mind entirely. Her name was Hannah Voss. She was 29, newly arrived in Millbrook after a job transfer, and just as convinced as Daniel that this whole thing had to be some kind of setup gone sideways. "I told my sister this was a terrible idea," she admitted within the first 5 minutes, and Daniel laughed so hard he nearly knocked over his water glass. What was supposed to be an awkward 30-minute obligation stretched into 2 hours. Hannah worked as a physical therapist at the regional clinic, the kind of job that required patience Daniel couldn't imagine having. She talked about her move to Colorado after a long relationship had quietly fallen apart, about how she'd almost declined the blind date 3 separate times that same afternoon. Daniel admitted he'd nearly turned his truck around twice. Neither of them could explain why they'd both shown up anyway. Somewhere around the second cup of coffee, the waitress, an older woman named Dot who had worked the counter at the Copper Spoon for as long as anyone in Millbrook could remember, walked past their booth and paused just long enough to give Daniel a knowing look. She'd seen 100 first dates end badly in that same booth. She would tell people for years afterward that she knew this one was different before either of them did. By the time the diner's lights dimmed for closing, Daniel already knew he wanted to see her again. He just didn't know yet how much that single decision would end up rearranging his entire life, or how the three friends waiting for his call that night were about to feel far too pleased with themselves. He didn't call them that night. He let them wonder. The next morning, when Marcus cornered him by the tool chest demanding details, Daniel just shrugged and said the date had been fine, nothing special, and went back to work on a transmission. It took Marcus another 2 weeks to find out the truth, and when he did, he never let Daniel forget it. Their second meeting wasn't a date, not officially. Hannah's car needed an oil change, and somehow she ended up at Daniel's garage instead of the chain shop 3 miles closer to her apartment. He noticed. He didn't say anything. He just made sure the job took a little longer than it should have. From there, things move the way they do when two people stop overthinking and start noticing. Coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into long Saturday drives with no destination, Just backroads through the foothills and conversations that never seemed to run out. They wandered through small-town festivals in towns neither of them had heard of before. They argued about music, agreed about almost nothing regarding movies, and somehow that made things easier instead of harder. What surprised Daniel most wasn't how much he liked Hannah. It was how much lighter he felt around her. For years he'd told himself he didn't need anything beyond the garage and a quiet apartment above it. Hannah never challenged that story directly, she just made it stop feeling true. There was a version of Daniel's life, the one he'd been quietly living for almost a decade, where nights ended alone in front of the television with a cold dinner and the sound of the highway outside his window. Hannah never said a word about that version of him. She just kept showing up until it slowly stopped existing. She was the one who noticed the sketches tucked behind his workbench, half-finished drawings of custom motorcycle frames he'd never shown anyone, ideas he'd buried under years of routine oil changes and brake jobs. "Why haven't you built one of these?" she asked one evening, holding a folded page up to the shop light. Daniel didn't have a good answer. A month later, with Hannah nagging him gently every week, he started building his first frame in the back corner of the garage after closing hours. Hannah had her own weight to carry. Starting over in a new town at 29 wasn't the plan she'd imagined for herself, and some nights the loneliness of it caught up with her more than she let on. Daniel noticed the nights she went quiet. He started showing up anyway, not with grand gestures, just with takeout containers and the kind of steady presence that didn't ask her to explain herself. Neither of them said it out loud for a long time, but they had become each other's anchor without either one signing up for the job. There was one night, a few months into things, when Hannah nearly packed up and moved back to her hometown. A rough week at the clinic, a phone call with her mother that left her in tears, and the old familiar pull of somewhere that at least felt known. She didn't tell Daniel any of that until much later. What she did tell him that same night, standing on her apartment balcony at 11 o'clock, was that she wasn't sure she belonged in Millbrook. Daniel didn't argue with her. He didn't beg her to stay. He just asked if she wanted company while she figured it out, and then he sat with her on that balcony until almost 2 in the morning, saying very little, staying anyway. She never brought up leaving again. One evening in late September, they drove out to Silver Lake to watch the sunset burn orange and violet over the water. Hannah sat with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the color shift across the surface. "I almost canceled on you 3 times that day," she admitted quietly. "I told myself blind dates always end in disaster." Daniel didn't look away from the water. "I almost didn't show up either. I figured it was another prank." "So why did you?" He thought about it for a moment. "Guess some part of me wanted it to be real." Hannah turned to look at him then, and neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. The silence between them said more than either version of the story they'd rehearsed to themselves that afternoon. It took Daniel another year to build up the nerve, and when he finally did, he didn't do it with a speech or a fancy restaurant. He brought her to the garage after hours, the same corner where he'd built his first motorcycle frame, and told her he needed a second opinion on the finished bike before he took it out on the road. Hannah walked around it slowly, running her hand along the tank, and then she noticed something engraved into the metal near the seat that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen it. Small letters, easy to miss unless you were looking closely. A question, not a name. She read it twice before she understood what she was looking at, and when she turned around, Daniel was already down on one knee beside the workbench, holding a small wrapped box he'd hidden behind his tools for exactly this moment. Hannah laughed before she even opened it, somehow already knowing exactly what it was. 2 years after a prank that was never supposed to go anywhere, Daniel and Hannah stood in front of family and friends at a small vineyard outside Millbrook and exchanged vows neither of them had planned on writing for anyone. Marcus stood at the front as best man, still insisting years later that the whole thing had been his idea from the start. Grant swears he knew it would work the moment Daniel walked back into the garage that Thursday night with a look on his face none of them had ever seen before. Dot, still working the counter at the Copper Spoon all these years later, kept a small framed photo from the wedding taped behind the register, right next to the old bell above the door. Regulars ask about it sometimes, and she tells the story the same way every time, always ending with the same line. "I told you, I knew that night." Somewhere in a drawer at their house sits an old paperback novel, the same one Hannah had been reading the night they met, its spine still cracked to the same page. Neither of them has ever admitted whether that was intentional. Marcus still claims full credit for the entire relationship at every family gathering, and Daniel has stopped bothering to argue. What started as a joke neither of them asked for became the one decision neither of them would ever take back. Proof that sometimes the life you were too afraid to hope for is waiting exactly where someone else decides to set you up.